Okay, thanks very much for having me here today. I'm really excited to share these thoughts with everybody here. Today I'm going to be talking about how we're not born racist. Okay, so about 5 years ago, Newsweek ran an influential cover story called "Is Your Baby Racist?", to which the authors of the story reported on several influential studies in developmental psychology to answer this question with a resounding and provocative yes. In the last few years, the idea that babies are racist has gained some traction, both among researchers and in society more generally. Just last year, Paul Bloom and Ira Glass were discussing this issue on an episode of This American Life called Bad Babies. And Ira Glass said, babies are racist. Okay, not exactly racist. They prefer whatever race of people they're used to seeing and being around, a description that Paul Bloom then agrees with on the show. But I'm going to argue that this is wrong, and that it's also problematic, not only because it gets the science wrong, but because this way of thinking can lead focus away from understanding the real psychological processes that lead to the development of social prejudice. So let's start with taking a look at the key evidence that people often refer to support the claim that babies are racist. What Ira Glass is referring to here is an influential visual preference study that tested how long 3-month-old babies look at a black face and a white face when they're placed side by side. They found that white Israeli babies, who are shown right here, looked longer at white faces, that Ethiopian babies growing up in Africa looked longer at black faces, and that Ethiopian babies growing up in Israel showed no preference for one or the other. So this pattern has been interpreted as supporting the claim that racial preferences are already in place by 3 months in an environment-dependent manner, which might be pretty good support for the claim that babies are racist. But before we get to that interpretation, we need to ask a really fundamental methodological question, which is, what does it mean for a baby to look longer at something? Does looking longer at something mean that babies like it better? That's what's implied when these findings are interpreted as suggesting that 3-month-olds prefer people of their own race. Sometimes that might be why a baby looks longer at something, sure, absolutely. But babies have also been found to look longer at things that they find just more perceptually familiar, and then also sometimes to look longer at things that they find perceptually unfamiliar. And with either of those patterns, babies looking isn't usually interpreted as meaning that they really like something better, but as resulting instead from a lower level experience-dependent perceptual bias. But to illustrate the ambiguity of babies' looking times in these paradigms even more clearly, sometimes babies actually look longer not at things they like, but maybe at things they find threatening. So, for example, 5-month-old babies look longer at this schematic spider than at either of these two other things, a differentiated pattern of finding of looking that you don't find when you present these kinds of stimuli, suggesting that by 5 months, babies have a pretty particular specific bias to stare longer at spiders. But this doesn't mean they necessarily prefer spiders over other sorts of things. Instead, this is usually interpreted as evidence for threat detection. So the point is that a visual preference in infancy shows detection of some type of perceptual distinction, and that might be an important thing for us to know about. But in itself, it is not indicative of a social preference or bias. Now, you might think, well, maybe that's the best we can do with a 3-month-old baby. Maybe we can't really get any more informative evidence than that, so maybe the interpretation is a little bit ambiguous, but really, what do you want from a 3-month-old? But there actually are ways to determine if babies have real preferences. There are paradigms that have been used very early in infancy that assess preference by seeing if babies will actually work to make something happen. So how do you get a 3-month-old to work? We might want to know. You make use of their tendency to suck in a systematic way, so by giving them a special pacifier is usually the most common way of doing this, and their sucking actually produces some change in the environment. And if babies are willing to suck harder and longer to make something happen, that's a little bit better, more convincing evidence that they like that thing that's happening afterwards. So that's the kind of method that's been used, for example, to see or to document and show that babies have sort of real preferences for their native language and for speech sounds in general. Now, to my knowledge, no study has ever used that kind of method to see if babies show what we might consider a real preference based on race, but there's been a clear test of this issue in somewhat older infants. This is a study that was done by Katie Kinsler with white 10-month-old babies who were introduced to these two characters who had identical toys. And the babies were simply asked to choose from whom they'd like to take a toy. And although this paradigm has shown that 10-month-olds have some systematic preferences based on some criteria, babies in this study had absolutely no preferences based on race. They were just as likely to take a toy from the white adult as from the black adult. And there's a fair number of studies looking at older children, ages 2 through 5, presenting primarily white children with stimulus with pairs sort of like this, and have shown that among children ages 2 through 5, at least growing up in the United States, the evidence overwhelmingly is that children do not automatically encode race. They don't use race in these kinds of paradigms at these young ages to select social partners or friends or choose who to get information from, and they don't view race as marking fundamentally distinct kinds of people. So although there's evidence that babies and young children sometimes draw perceptual distinctions based on race, or based on what we as adults think of as race, there's no evidence that they attribute to race a kind of adult-like social meaning. However, although it might not be present in babies, racism undoubtedly often develops, with often widespread and very severe and tragic consequences for people's lives. And this is why it's absolutely critical that we get the story of how racism develops right. If we simply say that we are born racist, then this can be interpreted by many as saying that there's nothing that we can do about it. If, on the other hand, we really take seriously trying to figure out what psychological processes and learning mechanisms are present in young children, how these processes interact with the environment to lead to the development of prejudice, then we might have to take the challenge to do things better a little bit more seriously. So these are the kinds of questions that we've been interested in my lab. Looking at what kinds of psychological processes and learning mechanisms are present in infancy and early childhood, what develops to lead to adult racism, and how does this development take place. One thing that there is robust evidence for within the first year of life and across early childhood is a kind of in-group bias. So children, like adults, prefer people who are similar to them, even on something relatively arbitrary like matching shirts. They want to be friends with their in-group members. They think their in-group members are smarter, faster, and overall better than their out-group members, and they share more resources with in-group members too. So why is that not racism? It's not racism for a really critical reason, which is that it is not about race. Children's in-group biases are very flexible, and while fairly easy to elicit in lab-based contexts, it's actually quite challenging to observe bias in children's daily behavior. The evidence suggests that while young children have the capacity for in-group bias, they often don't map those biases onto categories that they encounter in their daily lives. Another psychological process that's present in early childhood is the capacity to think in essentialist terms about categories. Psychological essentialism is the basic conceptual bias that leads us to think that this little baby, this adorable baby tiger, is inevitably going to grow up to be this ferocious tiger. And we assume this because we expect tigers to be born with a tiger essence that makes them grow up to share other tiger-typical properties. It's long been theorized that this kind of thinking, that thinking in this kind of essentialist manner, could contribute to racism, because essentialism would lead children to see racial outgroups as fundamentally, inherently, and inevitably different from themselves. But although children seem capable of essentialist thought, as I'll show you in a moment, they often do not yet apply this essentialist way of thinking onto race. So where the key developmental process might be then is in the mapping of these broad psychological tendencies onto racial categories. That is, that children realize there are many possible ways to categorize people, and that some of them might reflect important, fundamentally distinct and stable in-groups and out-groups, but they don't yet have any firm beliefs about which categories those are. What develops is the mapping of these beliefs onto race, the development of the belief that race marks these kinds of important differences between people. In my own work, we found that this is a fairly lengthy developmental process. So we've asked children whether they think race marks fundamentally distinct kinds of people, basically by presenting children with scenarios where they have to judge whether it would be correct for another society to group people in ways that do not follow racial boundaries. And we have found a slow, culturally variable developmental trajectory in children's essentialist beliefs about race. So we found that young children, ages 5 and 7, although they can sort people by race if you ask them to, did not think of that race reflected an objectively correct way of classifying people. That essentialist way of viewing race developed over time, but as shown by these different bars here, it did so more for some children than others. So the lighter bars are children growing up in a rural area that was relatively racially and ethnically homogeneous. And children growing up in that community developed essentialist views of race over time. The darker bars are children growing up in a more urban environment that is more politically liberal and diverse. And children in that community, again, although they were aware of racial categories, continued to view race as one of many possible ways that you could categorize people. So although young children have capacities for essentialist thought, it takes some time and it appears some particular cultural experiences for them to come to view race in particular in this manner. So how does this happen? If we think that what develops is the mapping of in-group biases and essentialism onto racial categories, the really critical question is to understand how. What features of children's environment and experience leads this to occur? Interestingly, the authors of the Newsweek article had some ideas about this as well. They suggested that racism increases across childhood because parents don't talk enough to their children about race. So they wrote, "Is it really so difficult to talk with children about race when they're very young? Parents are very comfortable talking to their children about gender, and they work very hard to counter-program against boy-girl stereotypes. That ought to be our model for talking about race. The same way we remind our daughters mommies can be doctors just like daddies, we ought to be telling all children that doctors can be any skin color. It's not complicated what to say. It's only a matter of how often we reinforce it." And while I agree with this on 2 points, first, that language is one of the most important features that shapes the development of social cognition, and second, that it can be helpful for parents to talk to their children about race, I strongly disagree that it is not complicated to do so in a helpful manner. It is, in fact, extremely complicated, because the type of language that they suggest here, things like mommies can be doctors just like daddies, has actually been found to increase, not decrease, children's essentialist beliefs about social categories. In our work, we've found that hearing that kind of generic statement about categories, mommies can be doctors, girls can do math too, and statements of other similar abstract structure, anything that makes a general claim about a category without modifying it to be about individuals or a subset, so things like Italians eat pasta or New Yorkers talk too fast, increase children's essentialist beliefs no matter what their content, compared to statements that express the same information by referring to individuals or quantified sets. So the idea here is that, as I said before, children realize that there are many ways of categorizing people and expect some of them reflect fundamentally distinct kinds. So that when they hear these kinds of generic statements like mommies can be doctors, the very subtle cue of the generic nature of the sentence, mommies can be doctors, suggests to young children that mommies must be fundamentally similar to each other and different from other groups of people for it to make sense to make this sort of general claim about them. And so because children are sort of on the lookout for what are the informative ways to group people in my environment, this fairly subtle linguistic cue can lead them to map their essentialist beliefs onto the category that they've heard talked about in that generic manner. This means that we have to be very careful in how we talk to children about categories. Children are often paying more attention to the structure than the content of our language. So I agree that we have to talk, but we need more research to figure out how to do so in a way where we don't unintentionally lead children to develop problematic ways of understanding social difference. So to sum up, is your baby racist? Probably not. And to understand how and why racism develops, we need to take developmental questions very seriously, to identify what psychological processes and learning mechanisms are really there in infancy and early childhood, what develops over time, and how these developmental processes take place, and most importantly, how they could be modified to prevent the development of social prejudice in children. Thank you.